Hello, people, guys, girls, gents, gals, everything else in between that are watching. Back with Steven. You can say what's up to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
We're currently going through a discussion of an essay on liberation by Herbert Marcuse. And Steven, could you tell us a bit about this essay?
Sure. So I started reading this essay after we did our videos on repressive tolerance. It sort of came at the recommendation of James Lindsay. He brought it up in conversation, so I decided to read it myself and see what I thought. It's an interesting essay because it's sort of the aftermath of repressive tolerance, as well as his earlier books, One Dimensional Man and Eros and Civilization. So he's sort of reflecting on some of his earlier ideas, but also writing after some of the riots that took place in the later 60s, which I would attribute directly to his ideas. So it's sort of showing the culmination of some of this thought, the results, and then him sort of reflecting on it.
Yeah, and for this, first, thank you if you're here for listening of these conversations. Stephen and I enjoy doing these, and these are conversations that we'd probably have with or without the recording, and we found some extra benefit of having this out there because, as Stephen mentioned, he got this from James Lindsay taking his time to put his material out there, and there's other people out there who've also inspired us to get into this content and just enjoy some of these things, and it's enriched our lives in certain ways. And we do understand there's other things you could be doing with your time, but with content like this, something like repressive tolerance, for some of you out there, you might have heard of that. If you've heard of Marcuse in this current climate, chances are you've heard of repressive tolerance. So for that one, I did a reading of the actual thing. This essay is a lot longer than that. And then we had a conversation about that. Was it a multi-part? No, we managed to do that in one part, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because
Okay.
it was sort of like this, but the essay, we highlighted in both cases paragraphs we found valuable, but repressive tolerance is shorter, so there was not as much to talk about. Whereas with this, it's a pretty long essay, so it's better to break it up.
Yeah, so with that one, I think it was 11 sections or something, and I took out different sections of it. And I had just read it for the first time a few months ago. Stephen had read it before, so we went to back and forth. In this one, we've done this in different situations. Sometimes it's content we've both read. In some of the conversations we have, Stephen's read it. And in this case, after hearing what was in Repressive Tolerance, Stephen and I were like, okay, this helps us make sense of some of the things in society, in culture going on right now, directly inspired by this. Or at least it explains some of it. There's some play. It's like the playbook of what inspired many of the plays that are going on right now. So the
Yeah.
base kind of info for it. Now this is more the theory, the game theory behind why those plays are those kind of ways. In a sense, it's the supporting thing. It's
Yeah.
kind of the Dead Sea Scrolls of the current statist neo-fascist kind of movements in the socio-political sphere. We still haven't thought of the exact way to put where this stands according to the things that are going on in society. But after reading Repressive Tolerance, Stephen and I thought, hey, I wonder what else Marcuse has written. What else has he actually discussed? What else can inform us about where he might have been coming from on those things, because we just had certain questions that have also come up in this conversation talking about this essays. Oh, I wonder what he would have thought if he had this other access to information, especially the information we have today. But this has helped me already see different parts, and okay, I can see why you were seeing that. And there's a lot of things that I think, like, yeah, I think if I had the access to the premises that he had, I might have agreed with many of these things, but because we live in the current timeline and I have the access to different information, I've been able to see other things. And that's why we thank you for taking your time to come to listen to this, because that's the kind of person, if you're that kind of person who's trying to understand why people are doing certain things, you don't have to agree with it. But if you want to understand and make some sense out of how some things are happening in society and what might be coming and what has come before, to kind of make sense to where we are now and just be more comfortable with what's going forward. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to say, I'm not going to do anything. You don't have to just fall yourself to it. But if you're aware of it and you're at all concerned about it, I think being more informed about it is a positive thing. And I don't think it's just for infophiles like Stephen and I, but I'm sure there's a lot of you others like us out there. So yeah.
So I was going to say James Lindsay actually has a good name for what they're trying to do. He calls it Dangism. This is named after Deng Xiaoping, who took over after Mao. He was the one who sort of liberalized China's economy because he realized, okay, communism isn't working, so let's open up to foreign markets, let's allow foreign investment, let's privatize farmland, but everything is still under the thumb of the CCP. Like, you can go to church in China, because remember, I think of that line in Forrest Gump about there's no religion. They allow the church in China, but again, it's under the thumb of the CCP. You can become rich, but you better do what the CCP does. If you don't, they're going to make you disappear and someone else is going to be given your company. So the woke, I think, are sort of operating in that direction. They criticize capitalism all the time, but I don't know how many are true socialists. I think they could be more like Deng, where it's, okay, we believe in business, we believe in all this, but we want it under the thumb, under our thumb, so we can decide what people can and can't say. And it's almost like the idea, I don't think we discussed it too much, but Foucault's idea, the panopticon, the idea of like, you're in a prison, there's a tower watching you, and you don't know if someone's watching you, but you think there could be, so that kind of keeps you in line. And it's almost like, but at the same time, you're not chained up. You can walk around and interact with other people. So like, there's some semblance of freedom, but you're still sort of under control. It almost reminds me of that a little bit. Like, okay, you can still have businesses, you can still officially say what you want, but it's like, if you go against what we want, we're going to ruin your life.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
accurately, most of what the average person in the United States of America is advocating for is a form of neo-fascism. It's not actual socialism.
Yeah.
And if you look at the actual beginning of socialism, and I think I'm forgetting his last name. Joshua someone was on the recent China Unscripted podcast, and he was being interviewed, and he just pointed out how socialism is inherently authoritarian. And at the beginnings of socialism, socialism wasn't separate from communism. Socialism was on the way to communism. They completely had admitted at that point. That's why this democratic socialism, I just posted this status saying, democratic socialism is just populist fascism. That's because what they're talking about, what Bernie Sanders, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, those kind of people advocate for, I prefer to call it now Alexandria Ocasio-Karen with a C. And I have going to release a short animation to kind of point out with something with her in that. But those people, what they're actually advocating for isn't actually socialism in the classical sense of it. And they even go there and they say, no, it's democratic socialism. It's populist fascism. As Stephen mentioned, it's getting certain things where you have certain monopolies as long as the state kind of controls them. Because the socialists in general, once they began, they had communism in mind. They were openly saying, we need to get to socialism because we get something that's mostly capitalist. Once capitalist starts getting some resource, capitalist kind of economics start creating this sort of environment, then we get socialism in there. We start pushing for socialism where we start getting control, where it's more out to the people. And then after we have that structure of the governing body that actually has the socialist state set up, we somehow dissolve that. And that's the part that always misses me. I never really find an explanation of how that state's going to be dissolved. But somehow, I think it's not necessarily just dissolution, but I think they advocate for and they set up certain situations that they think it's just going to fall apart. Socialism, the socialists had something in mind where they understood socialism itself cannot last. Once you achieve whatever socialist kind of ideals they had, they knew there would be no system for that to actually remain, and then that would crumble. And then from the end of that, there would be some way this new man, this new society would rise into this new communist kind of existence. And I think you sent me that thing of Hegel in like 35 minutes or something.
Yeah.
And I forget his name, Joshua someone. Let me double check for his name to actually check. He's someone, he has this show called Crossroads. But he was also talking about Hegel, and he was talking about how that was actually in there, how they didn't imagine socialism to be something that you can maintain. Even they completely understood with like the price calculation problem. They're like, no, we're not going to have a system. So once you have that, it will fall apart, and then the people will be so uncomfortable with the socialist system that they will demand it stop, and then communism will come after that. So that's something to keep in mind.
Well, yeah, it's the dialectic. It's the idea of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's the idea that you'll have a state, there will be people who will push back against it, and somehow out of that, that'll create the synthesis, which will be the stateless society. The state will, quote unquote, wither away, and then it'll somehow be this new man, and everyone will have, everything.
Yeah.
Again, how and why that's supposed to happen is never fully explained, but
Yeah. And with that, some of the things that Marcuse was saying in Repressive Tolerance, with that, some of the things Marcuse said in this article, in this essay as well,
yeah,
there's just certain massive holes where it's like, okay,
yeah,
I understand the points that you're pointing out,
yeah,
and trying to relate with the information that you had at that point in time being like, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but then what they attribute the actual problems to, I have questions about. And then
yeah.
once you have questions about and you can't agree on that, and there's definitely certain information that's left out, then the solutions that they propose are not going to fit because you're not actually working on the actual premises of reality.
Yeah. Well,
And
also James said in a I think it was to Michael Malice actually, a very technical name for these type of people is critical structuralists, because I don't think we talked much about structuralism, but that goes back to Saussure and the idea of it started with language, like, okay, where did certain words come from, then why are these the words, and then is that a reflection of power dynamics and imbalances, and they're the people who decide what everyone can and can't say, and that's reflected in the culture, et cetera, and originally this was with that, and then there was the idea of deconstruction. Okay, let's break all of this down, and that was Derrida, and then of course with language, but then it started being applied to other things. Some people have said that Nietzsche was a deconstructionist too, in a way, because he was examining where does religion come from, why are these traditions held, what is tradition, all that, and they're sort of doing that. They're applying critical theory to all the structures of society, the schools, schools, religion, pretty much everything. And that this is Gramsci didn't say it, but it's been attributed to him, the long march through the institutions. That's the idea of you seize control of all these institutions, you create the counter hegemony. Once you have control of all these institutions, that becomes a new hegemony, and that's how you get socialism. And some people have said Mao tried to do basically what Gramsci wanted, but of course Deng Xiaoping, who I mentioned a little while ago, he realized, okay, socialism economically doesn't work, so let's retain all the other stuff but go more in the direction of capitalism.
yeah.
Yeah.
And okay, the guy's name was Joshua Phillips.
Phillips. Okay.
With Joshua Phillips, not Phillips. Philip. Yeah. And some of the things that you're pointing out here is you have to think of who are the people who are talking about these things, because this is not the average person who's woke is going along with these things for various reasons. There are some parts of it that's become rather clear to me recently where it's more to kind of just prop someone up and feel, I feel like I've done something. There is an aspect of also there's this eerie racial, almost racist aspect to it, especially from the predominantly white upper middle class people that do that. They might not have achieved much in their life, but then they get to put themselves in a position where they can look at someone like Oprah and then say, oh, by me just being white, I am more privileged. I have more in a place of power. I have this prestige that someone like Oprah who's worked for it doesn't have. And then on the inverse, you have someone like Oprah. Like, I don't think Oprah really understands who Marcuse is.
No.
Now,
I doubt it.
I think she's also astute enough to pick up enough of the things out there and understand as a business person, as a public member in those fields, she hasn't gotten to that position without being a very astute and capable observer of the public sphere. And she can understand and put her finger in the air and know the wind is blowing this way. If I say these few things, this can actually get to me. Now, there's also just the added aspects. Like, what if Oprah comes out and says, like, yeah, I'm actually not really that oppressed. I've worked for everything I've earned. I don't think as a female I've been held any lower than any other males in this. Yes, there might have been some issues, but by the fact that those issues came up and I was black and I was female and I overcame that, that actually shows how much stronger a black female can be if she puts in the work than all these other white people that have been in my position, that have tried to get into these positions. And now here I am, and that's happened due to the United States of America. She says that you're not going to cancel Oprah, but does she get an interview with Meghan Markle, who wants to put up a thing saying they'd asked about, some random person had asked about the race of the child, the appearance of the child when that was happening? Is she going to get that interview? Probably not, if that's who she is. She would still have her billions, but once you get to that kind of place in society, what do you really need? You need that kind of cachet. You need to be held by certain people that are around you in a certain way, to be in the right circles and things like that. Some of these things are just, I think there was an article I don't know if it was the New York Times, the New Yorker or something, talking about it's a privileged beliefs. There's a certain group where you have all your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, most of those things in there. And
Mhm.
at the certain level, you have a job, you have a position, you don't really have some other things. So how are you going to get that extra prestige? How are you going to get that extra boost and feel that you've achieved more? Oh, you're going to be able to signal and have this thing where you've overcome this, you've beaten this struggle. Because that's, and I think is an inherent part of humanity, is we've lived in a state of nature where there's been constant struggle, you've been constantly striving to actually defeat some constant thing in your life. But so many parts of civilization have taken away some of those things, that I think to feed those things, we want to create those things. Some people go to video games, some people go to sports, some people go to social justice and wokeness, and they create their battlefield there, and they get to feel somewhat somewhat
Accomplished.
yeah, accomplished. But I think it's a junk accomplishment when it comes down to it, because there's nothing really there. It's like if you play a video game, you're going to get a certain drive from it, but it's not the same as going out there and literally being out there on the battlefield. If you actually have this wokeism, and I think this is part of what I see with some people, it's empty. Like you look at most of these people who supposedly are on it, there's some people, yes, benefiting a lot of money from it and things like that. But you look at the average person who's into wokeism, when they talk about the wokeism, when you look at their general life, are they in general happier for it? Like, is it really happier to actually believe some of the things that they say? So in that sense, I'm actually almost glad that they don't really believe what they say, because they would be a lot more upset. Now, the people who do believe it, think about how it really just starts breaking into their mind, thinking, oh, this is an entirely racist country. And I'm saying that a bit out of personal experience of trying to actually buy into this, and the cognitive dissonance and the mental the mental fissures that was occurring to me, being like, I know people like Stephen, who Stephen I met more recent, but I'm looking at people I've known since I was in the United States of America when I was like a kid. Maybe got there when I was like 10 or 11, and thinking at all my experiences there, and like, was it really this racism? Was this underground racism making me question all the people who seem to be just treating me as a normal human being who's from a different place and having these different understanding and things like this, just like I was treating them as different people? Was like, do I have to internalize this? So all these things, you're just jumping at ghosts. Just like if somebody really thinks there's ghosts, if a child really thinks there's a boogeyman under the bed, that child is terrified, even though the boogeyman isn't there. So this has been a boogeyman for some people, and some people have really bought into this, and some people have also really profited from it. And most of the people in the middle are just like, they kind of just say it to say it. Yeah.
Well, Malice and James Lindsay talked about sort of what you said as well about there's evolutionary psychology. I think it's factored in here. Now I'm reading that book recently, which caused a little bit of an uproar about religion and the psychology behind that. And it's very interesting. Maybe that could be a future video, but it's a fairly short book. It's about 100 pages, but it talks about how religious thinking hijacks a lot of our evolutionary tendencies, and they sort of compare it to craving junk food. Like the idea is, in the past, we still need sugar and fat, but in the past it was rare, it was hard to get, so that's why you have the cravings for it. So it was to make you go out and get it. It's just now, if I want sugar, I can walk around my block to Rite Aid and get a gallon of soda. In the
Yeah.
past, if you wanted sugar, you have to get fruit, you might have to brave it against the bees, you have to do something like that. Fat, you're only going to get from hunting game animals. Eventually dairy will come along, but then there's only so much of that, so it's not going to be cheap, et cetera, et cetera. Now you can get that stuff and pretty much well beyond what you could easily eat. But the thing is, those instincts are still there, and they didn't adapt to the supply in the future. And with the woke stuff, it's a similar thing, because people want status, people want to feel accomplished. But I would argue, I would argue a lot of this stuff is born out of psychopathy. We talked about the paranoid schizophrenia thing in the last one, but the idea that people in the context of this view, and it also relates to the Dunning-Kruger thing, they feel accomplished in this framework. Oh, I know all about racism. Oh, I've identified all the racism in society. I'm educated. I'm woke. I can solve the problems. But then again, like you say, you look at the bigger picture. Are you working for a company making good money? Are you successful? Are you getting a lot of prestige? Are people coming to you for things, or is it just you're knowledgeable in that framework among those people who believe it all? And again, in the framework of evolutionary psychology, it makes sense, but it becomes that sort of pseudo reality and that Dunning-Kruger effect of, oh, I think I know everything. But again, the people are just knowledgeable in the framework of that belief system in that group. And long run, that's not really good for anyone.
Yeah. And that's one thing we mentioned in the start of the last conversation was Darwin only got to the Galapagos Islands about 200 years ago, which is
Yeah.
relatively recent in the history of humanity. I don't think Marcuse was that aware of things like epigenetics or of
No,
evolutionary psychology. Most definitely, I don't think it would really. That's a rather recent field, and some of
pretty
the
new, yeah.
questions that are still just unasked. But now we got to the point where something like homosexuality, we understand there's a genetic aspect of it, there's a nature aspect of it. But at the same point, if you live in a society where there's a dearth of men, and there's some belief system where having homosexual relationships gets you killed, or you just have certain pressures in the society where there's a lot more pressure for reproduction, chances are, even if you have the same genetics as somebody living in San Francisco today, you chances are for you to behave and actually act on those will be different. You'll be like, okay, you have certain concerns and certain things that are going to, in your nurture, in your environment, that are going to pressure you to make certain decisions that would likely have you choose to live more of a heterosexual partnering type of relationship because you have more of an idea like I should have kids as fast as possible because I know it will bring me certain benefits in the society. I want a place in the society as an organism. You might still actually have more of the predilections to actually have romantic relations, like romantic attachments to people of the same sex, but you won't act on it in the same way. So they understand that. You understand if you're raised in a certain society where they throw people off of buildings for being gay, chances are you're not going to act on that much, even if you have the same exact genetics as somebody who is in a society where there's massive marches for you on a daily basis and flags and all these opportunities for you. You'll feel more comfortable to actually act on that. And now in both those places, some people have the same genetics, have certain things in their mind that will make them want to even take it to a further point and be more flamboyant to a certain level. Yet there's people who are just in the middle of that kind of same kind of genetics or same kind of pressures or same kind of selections that would look at somebody in those places that are more punitive to somebody behaving in that certain way and wonder, why would anyone even come out? Because there's still people in those locations that brave it and say, no, I don't care. I'm still going to brave it. I'm just going to be proud about who I am. I'm not going to be flamboyant. But maybe if that person had those same genetics in an environment that was less restrictive, maybe that would have made them be flamboyant if they were in this other place. But in that other place, it's just gotten them to be enough to get over and just say like, okay, look, I'm going to behave exactly like everybody else here. I'm going to go to the locations where we worship, where we do these. I'm not going to walk around with my husband or anything. I'm not even going to marry, but this is who I am. Like, this is who I am. I'm not going to do anything. So those kind of behaviors, due to the things in society, are going to select something. Now, in the same way, those things of its reproduction is part of a life form. Part of that has selected us in the genetics. It's been something that's driven to us. And like you're saying, there actually are drives into us that make us want to be the people who are somehow genetically more aware of their surroundings, aware of threats, are going to still be, are going to in general do better than other people. The same drive that we have to get certain resources, get certain foods, we're going to be better than other people who are just like, I'm not really going to care too much about being hungry. I'm not really going to care too much about getting meat. I'm not going to care too much about getting sugars. When there's a limitation of it, you won't get those sugars and you will die. So now that you have this kind of environment where back in the past, the people who were more aware of dangers seem to do better. Now that there are no dangers anymore, where does that expression of those dangers go to? And I think that's what I was mentioning. It goes to those unknown dangers. There's other things that are genetically driven into us. And I think that's some of the things that we need to consider and see why some people latch on to certain things. It's not necessarily that they believe that the people who are saying that there's danger, the exact dangers that they say. It's just that it is very human to be aware of dangers. So if somebody can come out, if a state, if an organization can come out and make you in a state of fear, state of awareness, that is something that we are primed to. We are primed as a human species to be aware of dangers, external dangers. So if somebody can find a way to voice and put those dangers into mind, people would rather err on the side of caution and say, yes, I might not have experienced racism, but if you say there's racism, that's something dangerous. So let's actually go along with this person who says they're better at it. Because even in the past, yeah, I might not have heard that. I might not have heard that twig breaking, but if you say a twig broke, let's all run. Because if you're like, I didn't hear the twig breaking, the saber-toothed tiger is going to eat your face. so I think we live in that kind of situation where the average person, if you start talking to them about this stuff with Marcuse, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? Hegel? Like, Hegel? Like, I don't care about the essay of liberation. I don't care about what you're talking about this. The average person is not in there. But if you're talking to the literati, the intelligentsia, those are the people who are moving and shaking. And I think this kind of content is good if you're interested to understand why those people are saying the things. If you want to understand why Bernie Sanders is saying the things that he's saying, this is the kind of stuff to listen to. If you want to understand why somebody on Twitter is just saying cancel this person for them saying this thing when they were a 17-year-old, this is not going to help you with that necessarily. Like, at least it will help you understand why they're saying it. Not even. I don't think it really does, because that doesn't really factor into why that person has just been told by somebody else that you need to do this. But if you have a debate or conversation with that person, don't expect them to bring up and quote Marcuse in that situation. Yeah.
Well, my friend Edward and I frequently talk about too, you also have to think about who's worth your time. Like the people who are deeply indoctrinated are just a waste. It's like, unless you learn about cult deprogramming and stuff, you can change them, but it's like, that's a serious project in of itself. The people who are kind of unsure, but kind of going along because they're scared of being attacked, those are the good people you should talk to, because those are the people be like, hey, why are they accusing me of this? Why are they saying this? And you can explain, well, this is the nature of the ideology. Here's how to fight it. And then it's like those, I find those types of people are worth your time. But like I say, the people that are like deep in it, I mean, it's like, again, unless you become a master of deprogramming cultists, it's next to impossible. And it's that whole thing too of the psychology of reactants. If you criticize them, they just double down. So it's like, you know, but then it's also the paranoid schizophrenic thing. If you start getting them to question things, they think you're plotting against them or something. So it's very tough. It's a very delicate operation.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think we get into it now.
Yep.
We've been doing this. Stephen has read it. He's pulled out certain paragraphs. So he reads the paragraphs and we discuss them after. We did an introduction part, and then there was biological foundation of socialism was the first section. The second section was the new sensibility. And today we're going to be in the third section, which is subverting forces in transition.
I took quite a bit from this one. I thought this was one of the more interesting ones. You'll see with the next one, I took only a very little bit because I find it's mostly stuff he said in some form or another. But I think this one's pretty good. All right. The same trend of production and consumption, which makes for the affluence and attraction of advanced capitalism, makes for the perpetuation of the struggle for existence, for the increasing necessity to produce and consume the non-necessary, the growth of the so-called quote-unquote discretionary income in the United States, indicates the extent to which income earned is spent on other than quote-unquote basic needs. Former luxuries become basic needs, a normal development which under corporate capitalism extends the competitive business of living to newly created needs and satisfactions. The fantastic output of all sorts of things and services defies the imagination, while restricting and distorting it in the commodity form through which capitalist production enlarges its hold over human existence. And yet, precisely through the spread of this commodity form, the repressive social morality which sustains the system is being weakened. The obvious contradiction between the liberating possibilities of the technological transformation of the world, the light and free life on one hand, and the intensification of the struggle for existence on the other, generates among the underlying population that diffused aggressiveness which, unless steered to hate and fight the alleged national enemy, hits upon any suitable target, white or black, native or foreigner, Jew or Christian, rich or poor. All right. Thoughts and comments?
Yeah, just to end here, it generates among the underlying population that diffuse aggressiveness, which, unless steered to hate and fight and the alleged national enemy, hits upon any suitable target. And that's the thing. That's one thing that really, I think, some people don't get. They wonder, oh, why are you pointing out to this group? Because it's, when you actually look at the details, it's not really about the group. It's just about having a target. That's pretty much what it is. It's just like when you open a video game, you start learning if you're opening a first-person shooter, it's not really about who those people are. I mean, you start building a story about it, but you know the general structure of a first-person shooter is you have your gun, you're walking around, and you need to shoot down the enemies. Now, there's stories that are built around why you're doing that, but the basic thing is you gun, shoot, enemy, target. So it's just the target. It's at the point that's a target. Some stories, sometimes you'll be in there, and you'll find out something switches in the story, and then the people who are in your team, all of a sudden you're in the other team. Some of those video games, you can just jump from one team or the other. But the general thing of you having a target is something that's naturally there, and that's part of why you see some of these things constantly fluctuating, or all of a sudden somebody will be targeted, and somebody does a certain action, that person is targeted, and then you find some new information about the person being targeted, and all of a sudden that's not a target because the certain things behind why you're supposed to target certain people has changed. That's not the current person you're supposed to be shooting. All of a sudden it switches around, like, or you stop shooting that person. So that's the kind of thing, and maybe I've said shoot too many times. It's going to get this flag down as well. But yeah, that's something on that last part you said there.
I didn't have much else to say about that. Notice he puts discretionary income and basic needs in quotes. Again, it's the usual utopian thing of like, oh, in my society, everything will be provided. Let me see here. Capitalist production.
One thing, as we mentioned before, we talked about the discretionary income.
Yeah.
I think that's something we can also talk about: discretionary social income, discretionary social political income,
Yeah.
where most of the people who just are dealing with day-to-day things, everyday life, trying to just make a living, trying to get along, worry about actual nature and things. Most people normally just deal with their day-to-day life. These things that are coming into these things, you look at the people who are mostly involved in this, people who have the extra time to go on Twitter, just like most people don't have the extra time to go on online and play Call of Duty or play StarCraft and play these things, put hours into games and start worrying about, oh, this game doesn't have enough, like the targeting on this weapon isn't good enough. Oh, this being in this game is too powerful and you shouldn't be as powerful. These other powerful, you need to check the actual status of them and make them more balanced and things like that. People who are dealing with just farming, for example, need to make sure they muck their cattle, make sure like they plant things. Those people don't have the time to go and do those things. They don't have this discretionary income in that mental capital to actually spend the social political energy in it. But now you also have these people who have discretionary time, discretionary social political income somehow. I don't know what would actually say, because that's what we were talking about. These people have too much time on their hands that they can go and start activism, like getting into activism on these fringe issues. If you're seriously spending your time to activize for a literal princess, like what how much free time on your hands do you have for you to go on and be like, this person who married into the one of the most wealthy white privileged family in the world is
Yeah.
somehow oppressed? For you to find that much time, that much discretionary mental income, mental time to actually spend your time on that, to me is part of what we were talking about before as well.
It almost like that's where the whole concept of like mental labor and things come from. It's like, oh, you're using my mental labor to have me explain things. It's like the fact that you have all this free time that you can consider that exhausting. How much luxury is that in of itself, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like for us, I do understand that I am in a position where, and that's part of why I decided to do this, because some
Yeah.
of these things I'm like, oh, is it out there? For me to even think, is this out there? That's really puts me in a position where I have extra time to actually think about these things, and then also to be able to record these and do the things and put it out there. But
Yeah.
that's part of the things. We understand we're also in a smaller group of people
Yeah.
that not everybody has the time to read and have a conversation about these.
Yeah.
But the fact that there's other people out there who actually have the time to do this, if you can have the time to activize for the people, why don't you spend some of the time in looking at the things that are behind it? And that's one of the things that I see is very lacking, because part of why I got into looking into this stuff was because I had enough time to be worried about the things people were telling me about society. So I was like, okay, if those things are really things about society, let me look into the actual data. Let me look into the actual background. And I found it to be lacking. And that's what I don't understand with the average people. Now, this is the average people. That's why I say they can't really believe this. They're just saying it because I know people with seeming levels where they would have the time, where it's like they virtue signal about something like this, and then they go watch sports. I'm like,
Yeah.
if you really thought United States of America was a racist country, wouldn't you be looking into the stats instead of
Yeah.
worrying about stats of some sports game so you can worry on your fantasy football? Instead of worrying about what Kim Kardashian is wearing and doing all these things, wouldn't you be actually looking at the actual police figures or the actual assault figures of things like this? If you really believe like Meghan
Yeah.
Markle was somehow people being racist against her, why do people say these things and then go and spend their time on rather frivolous things? In my estimation.
By the way, in case anyone wonders, my chair isn't here yet, so I'm sitting on my suitcase. It's a little awkward. So if you see me moving around, it's nothing's wrong with me. It's just kind of readjusting. But yeah, what you said, I thought of this guy recently who he's friends with somebody I'm close with. Again, won't mention names, but like I used to have him as a friend on Facebook, and his comments were either just like childishly mocking people or agreeing with certain people, obviously leftist, and if I would challenge him on certain points, he would say things like, "Oh, I don't have time to study this stuff. I have a life," or something. But then the thing is, he would come back to the comments, and not only would he respond, but he would react to the comments. So it's like, dude, you're taking the time to read through these sections. You obviously care. But then when I ask you serious stuff, oh, I don't have time for that. It's like, do you really care, or are you just looking to troll people to feel superior? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And
Yeah.
to the people who don't want to engage people so much in conversations, you can take
Mm.
things like these conversations we have. There's other people out there with sources, and that's one of the great things to like. That's at least if you care enough
Yeah.
about some of the people that bring these things up, and you want to think of engaging them instead of doing it directly. If you're not ready to do it directly and say, "I personally, as an individual, think this," you can say, "Hey, I was listening to this thing that Stephen and Silas were talking about. These two odd people online, they said this," or "Oh, look at this thing by James Lindsay." At least get out there and start sharing this information because, as I mentioned, the average person hasn't spent the time to look into the things. I was one of the people who was really freaked out about these things until I looked into the things, and all of a sudden I was like, wow, it's actually not that bad. It's been a lot worse in the past. A lot has been done to improve us to be here. Some of the things being done are taking us back to that past. There's this de-evolution of society coming in and things like that. We're actually regressing. So I call these people regressives. And the people who are regressing this are not doing it because they understand what's happening. In some cases, they're looking at stuff that is inspired by people like Marcuse, who was looking at a world from the 1960s. And in the 1960s, he wrote this in 69. The amount of information you had at that time was not necessarily accurate of what was actually going on.
Yeah.
You get very limited things of what was going on contemporarily. So some of the stuff he was really basing it on was from 10, 20, 50 years before that in those kind of things. So it took that long for that information to come together. As we mentioned with Darwin, he was on Galapagos Islands 200 years ago. But still today, how much of the actual information that Darwin found out there has actually spread around? So think about how much longer it took for information to spread around the world for actual accurate things. So now we live in a time where people are starting to try to organize and live in society based on an understanding or data information of society that was in the 70s and the 60s that was being limited about what was in there. So they're taking us back to a time that no longer exists. So this just a basic regression in that. So at least find these other people who have looked into these things, even if it's finding the actual people who they supposedly ostensibly support, quote them, find people that discuss that, and at least create some kind of save some kind of location where you have some kind of data, some kind of information to share with these people. And that would be one way to open them up. And I think they will thank you for it because some of these things, if they truly believe this, it's not a good world to be living in. But some of them don't really believe it and they still say it. And I think them just saying it is perpetuating things that are lies. And that's not positive for just the ongoing human flourishing experiment that we have going on here in society and civilization. Yeah.
So James Lindsay did a recent video too. He did a self-critique of cynical theories, and one of the things he pointed out, he's like, I'm relentlessly critical of my own work, but a lot of the people who criticize me, they either misrepresent me or they just say, oh, you haven't read or haven't understood the material. And he's like, we made a point to cite specific thinkers, things they said, the thinkers who quoted them, like Judith Butler citing Foucault, things like that. Now, yes, you can read all of Foucault's work and find disagreements with Butler and all this, but the critique is always, oh, you misrepresented or misunderstood what you're criticizing. Again, show me where the misrepresentation or misunderstanding is. That's a recurring theme I've had in debates with people too. They'll be like, you misunderstood this, it's out of context or misrepresenting. Then I say, where is it? And they won't answer. It's like, if I'm actually misrepresenting, I want to know. I want to make sure I get it right. But it's like, it's just used as some sort of deflection point or something.
Yeah, and I think that comes from the religions aspect because there used to be a time when all these ways of thinking about the world were tied into religion, were tied into foundational ways that we viewed society, where you couldn't really say we have a social structure of civilization that contains all these different ways of doing things. It was like the social structure that we call civilization is dependent on these certain belief systems, these things to be self-evident and to be thought of as true. So questioning some of these things was like, oh, you're wrong about this. Because if you were this wrong about that, the whole entire society had to be taken apart. But I don't think we live in, if you listen to this, chances are you live in a sort of world, I think we're already globalized, we're going to Mars and things like that, where we're at a point where I think we can survive having open discussion. In fact, I don't think we can survive not having open discussions about these things because humanity is humanity. During those times, we thought our civilization, our existence is going to end, but most of those things were limited. People thought like, oh, if we're living in some village or some civilization in Mesopotamia, if that ends, humanity's over, because that's all they knew about humanity. But
Yeah.
no, it was people in China during that time developing their own cultures. But the Chinese at that time, they thought they were the entire universe. They didn't understand those other people. The Incans and the Mayans, you can't question this stuff because they're like, if we die, humanity dies. But no, we're not in that kind of situation. We need to start taking all these different ways that we've thought of doing things and actually talk about them and say, what is the better ways of doing things and what are the things that we can leave behind? And when you talk about these aggressive people who are saying we can't talk about certain things, we can't question certain things, we're just going to take some things to be self-evident and truths, that's a horrific place to be going to. And that's a regression to the past.
Yeah, if we do a video on that book, Why We Believe in Gods, I'll elaborate more. But there is some interesting evolutionary psychology stuff, and I mentioned it before, but they talk about high functioning Asperger's being the next stage of human evolution, which I find really interesting. And I think the world in general is just going more and more towards individualism. I mean, you know, when we say this, people always act like, oh, you libertarians think that people just live like atoms isolated from one another. No, I mean, there's still people will still cooperate. There will still be groups. People will still work together. It's just you don't have to do what the tribe wants. You don't have to believe in the religion of the tribe because the world will end if you don't. You don't, you know, the things that you're describing, those are not relevant in today's world. And it's like the next stage is we can have our individualism, but at the same time work with groups and cooperate when it's necessary. And to an extent, that already happens anyway.
Yeah, and it's not a bad place to be. It's something that we're aware of. You can't have a collective without individuals, but you can have individuals without collectives. And we already are a collection of different atoms and organisms. Like, we're not going to say, oh, I'm just going to swap out my heart with my kidney. You don't do that. You're not going to be like, oh, my right arm is exactly the same as my left arm. No, we already understand that's not true. We understand there's skin cells, there's veins, there's hairs. Like, all these things are, some of the things somewhat interchangeable. Like, you can snap your Achilles and get a tendon pulled from somewhere else to somewhere else, but you're not going to all of a sudden just get your hair cells pulled from your hair to your Achilles. Now, with actually discussing some of these things, we're going to like the stem cells and things like that. We might get to a point where you can kind of reverse the hair cells and create other kind of tissue, but you have to reverse it to a certain point and then come back to another thing. So that's there. But most definitely, I think that Why We Believe in God book would be very interesting. I'd be very interested in seeing that. You said it was like 100 pages. I might actually read for myself too.
It's very short. Yeah, I got that from James Lindsay as well. You know, he's, I guess, my go-to guy lately. But he wrote another book about why everybody is wrong about God, and I started reading that. I'm reading that and this one simultaneously, and he really recommended this, and he said it's pretty short. But I'm trying to think of the guy's exact career. If he's something, not evolutionary psychologist exactly, but it's like paleo, it's anthropology and psychology, something. But basically, he went through all of this, and he cites like Steven Pinker, Jonathan Haidt, various other people, and he really examined this from an evolutionary standpoint. It's really interesting. It explains a lot of things. Cool. All right. Well, let's move on with Marcuse for the meantime.
Yeah. One more thing. Right. I'm just thinking with the 100 pages. This skit from this bit in Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David, where the person who plays George Costanza, Jason Alexander, he's in there and he's playing himself, but he wrote a book, and then he picks it up. This book's kind of thin. It's like, it's a bit of a booklet. It's more of a booklet, isn't it? Wouldn't you say? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. But while the image of the libertarian potential of advanced industrial society is repressed and in parentheses and hated by the managers of repression and their consumers, it motivates a radical opposition and gives it its strange, unorthodox character. Very different from the revolution at previous stages of history, this opposition is directed against the totality of a well-functioning, prosperous society, a protest against its form, the commodity form of men and things against the imposition of false values and false morality. This new consciousness and instinctual rebellion isolate such opposition from the masses and from the majority of organized labor, the integrated majority, and make for the concentration of radical politics and active minorities, mainly among the middle class intelligentsia and among the ghetto populations. Here, prior to all political strategy and organization, liberation becomes a vital, quote unquote, biological need. All right. Thoughts and comments?
All right. It's just, I'm trying to think what the class is. Does he go into more discussion of the actual class system? Because that definitely is there. There actually is. That's a weird thing that I see. Like, the people who claim that hierarchies are wrong or hierarchies about oppression are themselves making that case on hierarchies. And even by their argumentation, they're saying we've always had hierarchies, but then they're trying to create a situation that doesn't have hierarchies, but at the same point, they're placing themselves on the hierarchy of being in the position to be the ones to lead everybody else to that future where we're not going to have hierarchies. So it's this. Some of these things, I just wish they were more clear on what exactly is. It's kind of like we're talking about the video games before. How when you get a video game, you get the actual the walkthrough, you get the pamphlet showing the general structure of the game and the stress, and you're like, okay, you understand there's certain limitations to certain things, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is a lot more frustrating than many other fields that completely acknowledge and accept the parameters of the interactions and the constructs that exist. Yet this field seems to be very nebulous. Yet I'm not accusing Marcuse himself of this. Like the Marcuse is trying to actually get an attempt to do that, but some of the people who apply it currently will set up certain things, like I mentioned in a different conversation series, how there's no goalposts, how they're just on the field and occasionally put up goalposts and occasionally switch the balls out, occasionally like, okay, points don't count, we have to reset everything. So those are the people that I'm just like, I'm very frustrated with these people.
Yeah. I don't know if I highlighted it, I have to check, but there was a paragraph somewhere in here where he talks about the working class will no longer be the grave diggers of capitalism. And that relates to what I brought up last time about how he met with workers and they like in an auto plant, and they basically said like, the situation is not perfect, but overall we're happy. There's no need to overthrow the system. And I think he sort of realized, at least on some level, and he'll talk in here about white collar jobs too, I'll get to that soon, that things are getting better. So like there's less and less incentive to overthrow the system. Like if your living standards are improving, we can talk about inflation and things, but even with that factored in, you're still getting more goods, you're getting better goods, quality of life is going up. Well, why are you going to overthrow that system? Again, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you have those things and you have self-actualization and other things, why are you going to change things? Like I talked to Edward about this, I'm from a very small town, from those who don't know, and there's certain people who just never leave it. And for me, I wasn't happy there, so I left. But then my friend made the point that with me, it's like I didn't get all those needs. Like I didn't have a big social circle and all this. So like I went elsewhere to seek that out. Whereas people who are comfortable, people who have a decent job, they have all the friends they want, there's no real need to go beyond that because they have those needs met. So it's almost like it's sort of like a version of that where it's like, again, whatever you think of workers and worker conditions and all, things were good enough for the workers that those needs were met. So that, it's like, why are you going to tear down a system that's giving you what you need in the hopes that something better will emerge, especially if you're not like Marcuse and you haven't delved deep into this and tried to understand and everything. It's like, what, like you're not going to make those risks unless the promise of reward is so great.
Yeah. And also, so we have that knowledge of the hierarchies. We have that knowledge of that, like racism is something that's been a lot stronger in society, in culture. There's never been a really successful multiracial civilization. I mean, at different points, they can go to the clans and the smaller things and the tribes, but the places that really have a stronger identity or tribes are still very divided. In places like here in Africa, there's still, like I'm here in Kenya, and there's many different tribes, and there's still a lot of tribal tensions. And before the colonials came, it wasn't a nation because people were still very strong in that. People felt stronger about tribe 50 years ago, and some still do, than most Americans think about their perception of race, black, white, and things like that.
Like they keep saying lately, Asian Americans, it's like those are not homogenous groups either. And that sort of shows what the woke do, where they try to unite all these sort of disparate groups. Like that's what happened with, the LGBT stuff. Like they tried to bring pedophilia into that. Well, some did, not all. But then there's a lot of gays who are like, no, we don't want to be associated with this. But how are you going to make that one block? You're saying Asian Americans. Well, China and Japan has hated each other. They've gone to war, the rape of Nanking, all that stuff. And then, of course, Vietnam, obviously we went to war with them and then they became accepted here. Philippines, pretty good relationship with America, even though they were a former colony. So it's like these are not homogenous groups that all see each other as the same. So even just generalizing like that is pretty flawed in itself.
Yeah. And then, okay, so what is it? Because people look at the Jeff Bezoses of the world and they say, that's the white man. They look at the people at the top. They don't look at the people in Appalachia. They don't look at the majority of the homeless population. And I understand that. People look at the people who are above. And maybe in their personal lives, it's predominantly white country. Most of those people in those groups, they're also upper middle class. They probably personally know an uncle, an aunt, or somebody directly to them that is actually doing a lot well off. Chances are, in their personal life, they personally know somebody. The wealthiest people they know are white because of who they are. They might have come across some African-American, black people, and non-white people, but chances are those people were in a lower social class than they are. because in most cases, people of higher social classes seem to self-segregate into their racial groups, into their in-groups a lot more. Or they'll
Yeah.
be, if they're hanging out, those wealthy people, they won't be hanging out like LeBron James isn't hanging out with your average white people. Like you said, like
Yeah.
really wealthy white people. Like you're not just going to like run into LeBron James. And I'm saying he just hangs out with black people or anything, but like in that kind of case. So maybe the people you're meeting, that's why to them personally, they can look at Jeff Bezos and tie them closer to their uncle or aunt that they might know that's really wealthy, much wealthier than they are, but they don't connect. They don't know some black kid who comes to their school who has come from some place in their neighborhood that's not necessarily in their school district that's not as well off as their place and has worked their way up or comes from a different country, and they talked about the struggles and all of a sudden they come to that position and then they see that person but they don't connect that person to Oprah because to them the actual human black person they know is in a lower place. So for them they look probably down and say, since I personally know more black people that are down, they tie them in more to like that single mother in the hood kind of environment, even though they don't personally know the single mother in the hood. I don't know, that's the weird
Well,
thing.
we'll talk about it in the section in the next book about why we believe in gods, but there's some stuff in there about relationships and how, you know, they talk about how like your future relationships are indicative of your past, and it's like that can be true depending on the person. But they say think about some of the religious terms for the hierarchy: brother, sister, mother, father. Those are things that are familiar to you and give you a sense of comfort. So you
Yeah.
look up to mother superior, father so and so. It's like there is that need, especially when you're in times of trouble. I think it's that author, I don't know, James Lindsay might have said it. There are no atheists in foxholes. You know, it's like it makes sense. You're in a war. Like think of it early on in Saving Private Ryan when a guy is praying in Latin on the Normandy beach, because it's like you're in that time of trouble. You look for help either from someone either physical or something divine. But we still have that instinct that when we're in trouble, we look for that help. But for some people, it's easier to believe that there's some divine hierarchy or some divine figure that's looking out for me and will bail me out in my time of need. And that joke, no atheists in foxholes. If your soldiers, your friend, your comrades are getting shot at next to you, you're not going to look to them to bail you out because you're going through the same thing. Oh. Yeah.
Now tying that in, could they also be the people who have actually bailed them out are white people? So they kind of even looking at that as being like those are the people with the power.
It
I don't know,
could
but
be.
that's going to be good. That's going to be a good book to get into. But yeah, that's
Definitely,
it from me on this paragraph.
So all I was going to say was, notice that he uses form and he capitalized it. Now that could be his German grammar coming through, but I think it's likely a reference to Plato, like the idea of the forms, like the form of the commodity. This is the ideal commodity. Marcuse's English was excellent, so I think that's deliberately a reference to Plato.
Yeah,
And
this is well
again, you see, what's that?
As we've mentioned, he writes really well, and you also mentioned
Yeah.
that before in the different parts, but that's the first time you mentioned it in this section. And yeah, if you listen to the other sections, he's done that on a regular basis. So I think he's most definitely doing that. I'd bet on that.
And again, you see the Freud references too, where he talks about repression, you know, the whole repressed urges, all that. And also he says biological liberation. So it's sort of that Freudian idea of like you've repressed something, but then this is supposed to bring out that repressed urge. And that's kind of what he's doing, marrying the Freud with Marx, if you want to look at it that way. All right. All right. Moving on. The radical transformation of a social system still depends on the class which constitutes the human base of the process of production. In the advanced capitalist countries, this is the industrial working class. The changes in the composition of this class and the extent of its integration into the system alter not the potential, but the actual political role of labor. Revolutionary class, quote, in itself, but not, quote, for itself, objectively, but not subjectively. Its radicalization will depend on catalysts outside its ranks. The development of a radical political consciousness among the masses is conceivable only if and when the economic stability and the social cohesion of the system begin to weaken. It was the traditional role of the Marxist-Leninist Party to prepare the ground for this development. The stabilizing and integrating power of advanced capitalism and the requirements of quote-unquote peaceful coexistence forced this party to quote-unquote parliamentarize itself, to integrate itself into the bourgeois democratic process, and to concentrate on economic demands, thereby inhibiting rather than promoting the growth of a radical political consciousness. Where the latter broke through the party and trade union apparatus, it happened under the impact of quote-unquote outside forces, mainly from among the intelligentsia. The apparatus only followed suit when the movement gained momentum and in order to regain control of it. All right.
Okay, the apparatus only followed suit and the movement gained momentum. Then up here he says, revolutionary class in itself, but not for itself, objectively, but not subjectively. Its radicalization will depend on the catalyst outside its ranks. The development of radical political unconsciousness among the masses is conceivable only if and when the economic stability or the social cohesion of the system begin to weaken. So, and I think that's part of what we've been talking about before, how the socialists kind of set up a system that actually weakens the economic stability and the social cohesion. There's a part in there, like I just was thinking about Ed's democratic socialists, actually just populist fascists, and they just wanted to put this extra thing out there. It's really interesting how the fascists have switched R for F in order to have you not see who they are. And that means the fascists have taken the F from fascism and put an R into it and made you focus on racism in order for you to not notice that they're actually fascists. So, they don't want you to focus on the fascism that they're actually pushing for by making you focus on racism that doesn't exist as much. And I think that's something you definitely see there. Now, this thing again, the way he's writing here, is he advocating for this, or is he just observing and making an observation of what's actually happened, which I agree is what happens?
Well, I think, again, it's like it goes to what I said in the last point about how he kind of realized, like, okay, the working class is not going to overthrow the system. And that's I was going to actually bring up Marx and Lenin here, because the idea that Lenin, that's what Marxism, Leninism is. It's the idea that, okay, the masses are not going to wake up on their own. We're technically bourgeoisie, but we're going to wake them up on their behalf. They're going to rise up, become socialists, and then that's going to lead to communism, etc. And of course, that's what Lenin tried to do. Stalin tried, basically similar version, I would say a bit more repressive. Mao tried some version of that. And then some have said that's what the woke are trying to do as well. Like, that's why James Lindsay calls the woke stuff Leninism 4.0, because it's the same basic idea. Okay, we know what's best. We're going to wake up these people, and then they're going to overthrow the system. And then that's where he talks about, traditional role Marxist Leninist. He talks about parliamentarize itself, the idea that it's sort of like it says, you're integrated into the bourgeois democratic process. So, okay, you have candidates that represent those interests. That's supposed to be like AOC and Bernie today. We can debate the merits of that, but that's the idea. And then the idea is that, okay, it'll actually be in the system, versus if there's just a radical movement that stays outside of it and destroys things, it's not going to have power. And I think that's what happened. I mean, I can't speak for Marcuse, obviously, but I think that's kind of what happened with people like Angela Davis, his mentee, because, she was cheering East Germany. She was going to these anti-Israel things, all this, but like, she was on the FBI watch list, and like, she went to jail. And I think he realized you can't have this radical thing outside of the movement expected to take hold. You have to sort of infiltrate the institutions, as we talked about with Gramsci, at least to a point, and then that's how you sort of win people over. That's what I take it to mean, anyway.
Okay. Yeah, so he's just pointing out the modifications in the structure of capitalism onto the basis and the development of an organization of a potentially revolutionary forces. So modification. So you can say modification, some changes in it could actually make it harder for this organization of potentially revolutionary forces. Some can make it easier. And I think this is where you go into that whole neo-fascist type of thing, where they want to have some control over some aspects in order to modify it. And I don't think something free, that's why I think it's not free market capitalism, when you have this system where you have these modifications. The modifications are those regulations, are the taxation, are the special pleading, are the lobbyists and things like that. So they want to get into that class, because once they're in control of the modifications of that structure, they can help lead to a situation that develops a revolutionary force in more of a sense. So I think there definitely are certain aspects, certain people in different positions that are trying to get that done and trying to make sure that they have actual gravediggers for whatever they refer to as capitalism. So yeah, that's something that I think.
Well, think back to our discussion on critical race theory. The idea was that the civil rights movement didn't go far enough, and Derek Bell came up with the idea of interest convergence, that things like segregation things like ending segregation were just sort of placating the more radical black populations, and that it didn't go far enough. And I have to look more into this, but Angela Davis actually said in an interview that Marcuse actually got fired from Brandeis because he was too radical. Now, she said there was more to the story than that. I don't know the details, but I think that's kind of what he was seeing here, that you can't just come out and say, okay, we're going to tear down the system and implement socialism. People aren't going to get behind it. So you have to find ways to sort of inch into the system, gradually take it over. And critical race theory has a similar approach. Like, the general ideas, and then later there was critical pedagogy, and then it got applied to, originally it was the law, but then it started getting applied to voting and everything else. It had to find a way to sort of infiltrate the different institutions, these different movements, all this. That's where the whole critical structuralist came from, and then that's how you take over. But it's like just saying we're going to tear down the system, give us power. No, it'd be very hard for everyone to get behind that.
Yeah. That's it for the paragraph.
No matter how rational the strategy may be, no matter how sensible the desperate effort to preserve strength in the face of the sustained power of corporate capitalism, the strategy testifies to the passivity of the industrial working classes, to the degree of their integration. It testifies to the facts which the official theory so vehemently denies. Under the conditions of integration, the new political consciousness of the vital need for radical change emerges among social groups, which on objective grounds are, in parentheses, relatively free from the integrating conservative interests and aspirations, free for the radical transvaluation of values. Without losing its historical role as the basic force of transformation, the working class in the period of stabilization assumes a stabilizing conservative function, and the catalysts of transformation operate, quote unquote, from without. All right.
Okay, the catalyst of transformation operate from without, under the conditions of integration. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily something that could be seen with the matching of this identity politics and saying we need to put everyone together in certain groups. But then it seems to be many of the results of these are people who are advocating and saying, oh yeah, if those groups want to self-segregate, more power to them. Because some of this aggressiveness seems to be more about segregation than actual integration.
Yeah.
And then saying the new political consciousness for the vital need of radical change emerges among social groups which, on objective grounds, are relatively free from the integrating. So the new political consciousness. So this could be a thing. Could it be from the certain group of people that you look at many of the people that actually are very activist into these regressive woke kind of things, you look at them personally, their actual social groups, and they tend to be a lot more segregated into certain social groups than others, because they say, oh, this is my lived experience. So with their lived experiences, they need to live among their peoples and things like that. I don't know how much actual integration there is with certain these groups. Like, you look at some of the places where it's most active in the urban areas, and those areas really aren't really that integrated. They might think that, oh, because we have a lot of black people in New York means that me as a white person activizing in New York for black people, but because there's so many black people in New York, most of those black people can hang out with black people. Most of the white people can hang out with white people. Most of the Asian people can hang out with Asian people. Most of the Chinese people hang out with the Chinese people. Most of the people from Jamaica hang out with the people from Jamaica. Most of the people with Jewish background hang out with the people from the Jewish background, from like certain places, certain actually sects in them. So when you have that much quote unquote diversity, which is not necessarily integrated, it's more just options. And there was a different part of society where it was more like you had to you lived in societies where you'd actually integrate mostly on economic grounds in order to actually mesh with other people in your society. And now if a black family moves to like a small town, they can't just be like, I'm just going to hang out with black culture. I'm just going to go to the black movie theater. I'm just going to go to the black gym. I'm just going to go listen to the black owned cafeteria, the black owned restaurant. It's like, no, they'll be in a situation where it's like, hey, we're going to meet up in these places. If a black family moves somewhere and they're like, okay, I'm going to open a hardware store, people don't start and think like, oh, we don't have a hardware store. We're going to wait for the white hardware store to start. So we're not going to go to that black person's hardware store in this small town. It's like, no, they'll be like, that guy is the one who's had the hardware store, so we'll go there. And there's more of a movement to actually integrate in certain environments that I don't think necessarily exists in most urban areas where you have a lot of these actual tensions and these movements coming out of. From what I've observed with the United States of America and having lived in major cities and some very country-ass areas. Yeah.
Did you ever see that clip of the Democratic Socialists of America, the meeting, where it's like those people are woke to a point of insanity? Yeah. Like they're like, hello, I'm so and so, pronouns he, him, and then it's like, and then he's like, please keep the chatter to a minimum. I'm very easily overstimulated. It's very distracting, all this. And then I think somebody said, hey, guys, that somebody else, don't say guys, point of privilege. That's gendered language. It's like, how are you going to get anything done? You guys are offended by every single thing. It's like, how do you even accomplish anything?
Someone like, who are these people? Like, how many people actually know the people like this? And clearly there are people who do. Now, those people might not be people listening to the content that I'm making, but I'm chances are from the people who are listening to this know someone like that. I've been more of a hermit type of lifestyle, and I imagine if I really got back in touch with some of the contacts that I had from my time in the United States of America and traveling around, I would find people like that. And if I was just in a more typical job that deals with society in general, I would find some people like that. But it just seems so tiring to live that way. It's tough, yeah.
What was I going to say? It's interesting here. He says transvaluation of values. That's actually, I think, a Nietzsche reference, because he talked about that in The Will to Power. He was criticizing Christianity and other nihilism and other things, and his final book was going to be a book about new values, but Nietzsche lost his mind before he was able to do that. And he cited Nietzsche earlier in the year, so I think that's kind of what he's doing. There's some Nietzschean themes too of like, okay, it's like he's Marxist, but there's still that idea of like, okay, we're going to replace the old values with something new altogether and not use the old ones as the basis. It's kind of interesting.
No wonder Nietzsche lost his mind. In current year, would he have been considered to have lost his mind, or would he have still been entertained? Like, has that definition kind of changed? Yeah. I don't know.
All right. Yeah, I think that's about it. Okay. This tendency is strengthened by the changing composition of the working class, the declining proportion of blue-collar labor, the increasing number and importance of white-collar employees, technicians, engineers, and specialists divides the class. This means that precisely those strata in the working class which bore and still bear the brunt of brute exploitation will perform a gradually diminishing function in the process of production. The intelligentsia obtains an increasingly decisive role in the process. An instrumentalist intelligentsia, but intelligentsia nonetheless. The, quote, new working class, end quote, by virtue of its position, could disrupt, reorganize, and redirect the mode in relationships of production. However, they have neither the interest nor the vital need to do so. They are well integrated and well rewarded. To be sure, monopolistic competition in the race for intensifying the productivity of labor may enforce technological changes which may come into conflict with still prevailing policies and forms of private capitalist enterprise. And these changes may lead to a technocratic reorganization of large sectors of society, even of, in parentheses, even of its ideology and culture. But it is not clear why they would lead to an abolition of the capitalist system or the subjugation of the underlying population to the apparatus of profitable production for a particular interest. Such a qualitative change would presuppose the control and redirection of the productive apparatus by groups with needs and goals very different from those of the technocrats. Technocracy, no matter how quote-unquote pure, sustains and streamlines the continuation of domination. This fatal link may be cut only by a revolution which makes technology and technique subservient to the needs and goals of free men. In this sense only, it would be a revolution against technocracy.
Okay. I like here that he actually defines here the blue-collar labor. I, again, will reiterate my frustration with people who use the term worker, because I think everybody's working, whether you're somebody who just wakes up every morning, puts on makeup, and turns on a camera, and you open your OnlyFans, and then you dance and answer requests by people, and you post images. That's the work. That's as much work as somebody who's a literal grave digger going out there and digging graves, or somebody who's a garbage man. Those are all different forms of work, and we've now used technology, time-saving devices, to find many different ways of work, because without some of these technologies, we would all just be involved in farming and obtaining just basic resources to just handle the whole idea of being alive. So that's something that I will reiterate every first time it comes up in every conversation, and that's the first time. And for most people, this is what I'm saying, most people are not, who talk about these woke things, haven't actually read Marcuse. Because like here you can see he's pointing out that he's saying this new working class, and he puts it in quotation marks, and he's saying this is different from the general definition of working class, because before there was technology, there was a rather split in what work was versus the people who were literally it was like everyone was a worker. It was for like 95% of us, 99% of us were workers. And then there was a royal class that literally did not work. Like now, I guess there's something you can think about. Like I think the royal family, being in the British royal family, is work, and that's why I think when Harry and Meghan decided to leave, there's a certain salary and that they're given because you have to actually perform. You actually have to know certain things. You have to know the way to behave in certain places, show up at certain locations, make certain speeches, do certain charitable things. So there's actually even work in that sense. But it was a different sense where people were like, okay, this is more performing, this is more actions. That was a different kind of class of it. But here, pointing this out, because something that came up with the ship that was stuck, the Evergreen, that was Ever Given, that was stuck in the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal. It was stuck in there, and then there was that meme or that little digger digging out that someone's like, oh, look at these people talking about minimum wage shouldn't be a thing. Now the entire global markets is relying on this unskilled labor. And somebody was like, haha, who's this person thinking someone who can actually handle a digger is unskilled labor? Like here you see he's talking about, he's saying new working class. It's still the people who are in the different parts of the working class are, just because it's, right now most people think service industry isn't necessarily, they think there's a difference between white collar, like white collar is not workers. And then everybody who's in blue collar and service industry is working class. But that's not accurate. That's not an accurate way to actually divide these things, where there are some people who are very skilled. They try to interchangeably use the term skilled and unskilled labor to blue collar and white collar. And then they say, like, if you're in white collar, you're not a worker in that kind of sense. And I don't.
Well, so the neo-Marxists, the challenges they had is they talked about what was called a post-industrial society. Because you think about during Marx's time, he wrote maybe like 1840s. Well, because in 1840s, think about it. What did you do? You were a farmer, a laborer, you were a wealthy business person, then maybe you had academics, police, few people like that. So he didn't foresee all these white collar jobs. Like, it's funny. I looked up. There was a when I worked at the retirement home, there was actually a couple that lived there. They were the longest married couple in Dutchess County. She died first, and he died a little while later. They were married 79 years. And wow. It's crazy. Yeah, the world record's 82, but I was reading his obituary and it said he worked for IBM in the typewriter division. And it's just funny to think of that now because I'm like, oh, wow, they actually had a whole division of people that just did this. But I would imagine during Marcuse's time, because I think that was in the 40s. So that was kind of between then and now, where like I think Marcuse's time, he died in 79. So computers were coming around, but they were in the very early stages. So you had these big mainframes and things like that. There were no computer divisions yet, but they were heading more in that direction. And I think that's where they kind of saw like, wait a minute, where do we go from here? Because it's like, it's not everything gets automated, everyone's out of work, and then it's just dirt poor and ultra rich. It's no, you have people that actually make good salaries, but working from a computer or typewriter or whatever at that time. And that's kind of like Marx and Predictus, where do we go from here? And of course, again, being good Marxists, they're not going to re-examine the theory and everything. They're just going to double down or find some way to squeeze it in.
Okay, so maybe post-industrial is kind of a situation where we can say we're like a post-farming civilization, where it's not that we don't need farming as much as we did in the past. It's this farming isn't one of the primary things majority of humans that takes up majority of our time. So I, in that sense, I would kind of agree that at least the West is kind of post-industrial in the sense where there's still the industries are much more productive, and civilization relies on the results of industry much more than they did in the past during the industrial age. But at the same point, it's taking far fewer percentage of human work in order to keep those industries going. And that's part of, as Alex Epstein says, we live in a machine labor civilization where machines and having abundant, reliable energy is part of the reason that we don't have to spend so much time in the actual industries dealing with some of these things. So I think that's kind of it.
When we eventually get to human action, we'll talk about it. But Tom Woods brings up the example of his father working a forklift. It used to be you had to pay a few guys to lift heavy pallets. Then it's okay, you can pay a guy with a forklift a bit more money, and he just does it all himself. But the machine makes him more productive, so he can get a higher salary for moving the same amount of stuff. Yeah. I think the Marxists don't factor in things like that. They have a very skewed idea of how that works.
Yeah, because this whole idea of technocracy, that's one thing I would like to understand. What would he mean by that? Would he think now we're technocratic because we use computers to make calculations about things that make us just exponentially more productive than we were in the 70s? One person themselves, just by having a computer that can calculate and say, instead of sending this one individual here, send 10 individuals to these other places, and then you'll have 100 100%, or you'd have 100 times the actual results from sending that one person to that first location. That kind of thing, he would consider that to be a technocracy, but I don't understand what he would think would be negative about that, what world that he wants, like, after that kind of situation. I don't see it.
Well, I think it's something Foucault criticized as well, and Foucault was actually somewhat right. Like, in a way, like the idea that the people in power decide what science is acceptable and use it accordingly. So that's sort of been the criticisms of people like Fauci and other people, where it's like, oh, these are the experts who decide we have to stay locked down forever, but they're the scientists, trust them. But then it comes down to, is this actual science by some objective measure, or is it the people in charge just deciding, if any science, what they want to use? So there is something valid to that. But again, I don't know enough about Marcuse to know exactly what he meant in this context. In my opinion. All right, let's see here. The ghetto population of the United States constitutes such a force. Confined to small areas of living and dying, it can be more easily organized and directed. Moreover, located in the core cities of the country, the ghettos form natural geographic centers from which the struggle can be mounted against targets of vital economic and political importance. In this respect, the ghettos can be compared with the faubourgs of France in the 18th century, and their location makes for spreading and quote-unquote contagious upheavals. Cruel and indifferent privation is now met with increasing resistance, but its still largely unpolitical character facilitates suppression and diversion. The racial conflict still separates from the ghettos from the allies outside. While it is true that the white man is guilty, it is equally true that the white men are rebels and radicals. However, the fact is that monopolistic imperialism validates the racist thesis. It subjects ever more non-white populations to the brutal power of its bombs, poisons, and monies, thus making even the exploited white population in the metropoles partners and beneficiaries of the global crime. Class conflicts are being superseded or blotted out by race conflicts. Color lines become economic and political realities. A development rooted in the dynamic of late imperialism and its struggle for new methods of internal and external colonization.
Just one question here, I think, is to ask people who are listening to this. It's one thing we can't ask Marcuse, of course, not just because I don't know him, but he's also dead. He's passed away. But just for people who think about this when they read this, do they think racial relations were worse or better in 1969 than they are today? I personally think they're a lot better.
Yeah.
Some people might not agree with me. I think there might be certain enclaves of people who are a lot more tense and intense with their dislike of other races than they might have been back then. It might have been just more general, and with more information, there's a lot more information that people can use to say that they're actually basing it on X, Y, Z than they did in the past, when the past was more just a feeling, and I think was more just driving off of our inherently tribal and in part racist backgrounds. It just was just a state that we used to live in. We, in general, knew one group of people. It was normally our family, not even just the family, then the clan, then the tribe, then the village. That's how most of society has been. And chances are, if you met somebody from outside of that general group that you knew of, they didn't have your best interest in mind. But then now you live in times when chances are a majority of the things that help you the most in your life have come from people in your outgroup. Like, you look at these areas, like you mentioned here with the ghetto population, those places have balkanized in a sense and concentrated themselves out to where they're just kind of sociopolitically irrelevant. They already know, like, if this place is, when you have a situation when votes are coming in from an area in the United States of America, and they're saying, oh, there's 2,000 votes have come in from this area, and only 5 of them are from this candidate, but 1,995 are from another candidate, and people just don't even shrug. They're like, yeah, that seems normal, because they know one thing about that area. They know it's predominantly black. What does that say about that group? What will it lead for whoever is actually saying we need this group when they actually already have that? And I think any socio-political demographic in the United States of America, the most solid voting bloc is black women. Most solid voting bloc, even to the doubling to that. It's just in general black women, because yes, you can count the single women or unmarried. No, it's just 95% of them in general just vote one way, like across the board, like this going across the last 20 major elections in the United States of America, if not longer. So when you have a group like that, what does that say about that group? What other things about that group does it care about? And what has led to that situation? What has gotten to that point where that are you saying like all the side that these people have voted for, the policies of that side have been the same throughout that time, and you can say there's actually been benefits to that group by voting in this one way over that time. I don't see that. I don't understand this. I don't understand some of the racial issues that people talk about, and that's maybe in part just due to my lived experiences of these things. It's something it's frustrating to me and still perplexes me in many ways about the United States of America. Yeah.
Well, again, we'll talk about it with the next book, but James Lindsay always talks about this a lot too, that like we don't have to constantly say why racism is bad. The majority of people are against racism. Let's focus on actual problems. And he makes the comparison to atheism, same thing. Atheism is just simply the absence of belief in God. And he was critical of things like atheism plus, there were atheism churches, there were all these things. He's like, okay, we've made the basic arguments. We've explained the scientific stuff. We've explained the psychological needs. Let's focus on where we go from here. Just refuting this stuff over and over. It's sort of like, I guess it goes to my earlier point about when you're trying to, we're obviously criticizing woke people, but it's like, I'm not going to write full-fledged critiques of woke people over and over because it's like the people who should probably read them won't. And then it's like, it's better off focusing on the people that are kind of on the fence but could be swayed, because it's like, yeah, there will be evil, racist people. There will be Klan members, whatever, in every society. But except for Daryl Davis and a few others, is it really worth spending your time trying to change those people out of their beliefs? Because even if you change them, it's a few people, and likely they're not going to listen to you anyway. So why bother? Oh.
Yeah, I think a good thing for the people who deal with racist people, if you are of X race, and there's somebody of Y race who thinks X is inherently below you, I don't think it takes too much. It's not good for you to spend your time to try to convince Y, because Y is probably being irrational to begin with. So you're not going to be able to provide reasons of it. I think for me, it's been more effective for me to look and say that as an X who Y thinks is this, how much is Y really preventing me from doing this? How many people are like Y? And when I looked, I was like, okay, if I know Y lives in this area, lives in these woods and does these things, I'm not going to move to those woods and do those things and live in that place and have a burning cross in my yard. It's like there's a few thousand of those people and I know where they are and I can avoid them. Yet I'm not going to use those few thousand people who are Y and then assume that the other 10 million or the other 100 million people who have some features similar to Y are like that as well. No, I'm not going to do that, because that's what Y is doing to me. Y has probably experienced something right or wrong about somebody who has a similar feature as me as an X, and then uses that experience to say I'm like me and everybody else with those features is like that. And I don't want to perpetuate that, and don't need to focus on that. So with these things, I think with conversations like this, I don't really see this really somebody who truly believe or says they believe the woke stuff coming across as like, oh, maybe you're right. Maybe if this is like the 10th time or 100th time they listen to something similar, yeah. But I think I'm reaching out mostly to the people who already kind of question some of these things, already agree with some of the things more towards the individualism thing, and telling them, look, this is not something that they've already controlled. I think don't just give up. Don't just say, the world is over. United States is done. Like all these positive things that were done and done. Let's just bunker up and be finished. Like, no, there's still, these people aren't basing it on it. They don't have a strong foundation. This is not a done war. This is not a battle that it's lost. Like, yes, they have certain positions of power. Yes, they seem to be doing certain things. But even the people in power, like I mentioned with Oprah, I find it hard to believe if Oprah really goes home and really sits there and is like, man, these white people are damn oppressing me. And even if she thinks they are, I don't think she thinks she is in a situation where she can't do anything. Oprah doesn't sit there, whether she believes it or not, she doesn't sit there and say, I'm not going to go out there and work my hardest to earn as much money and be as Oprah as possible. So why are you on an inverse being in a situation where you're like, okay, these people have the power, they've defeated us, like there's no point for reason, there's no point for actually attempting to build and create these other things in this environment because it's game over. No, don't fall into that. Don't fall into that abyss. Don't fall into that darkness. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say too, like I was talking to my friend about this, like girl I used to work with who like I was kind of friends with, but she went down the woke path and she's like real fanatical now. And I said to him, like, it's kind of sad because, we were friends at one point and I still talk to one of her sisters, and like, the sister was way more reasonable than her. And I was like, it's kind of sad, but I thought about it. I'm like, am I really going to spend time and energy trying to talk her out of her beliefs? It's like, she's one person with a few friends that agree with her. Even if I win, it's like, how much will I change? Okay. I deprogrammed 3 cultists essentially, or whatever. It's like, they don't have much power. They don't have a lot of say. Yeah. It's sad that the friendship ended because of that, but it's like, is it really worth going back and trying to change it? It's like there's a certain point I don't really see. Even if I win, will it make that much of a difference in the longer run? Probably not.
Yeah. It's about picking where you spend your energy, just being more selective with that, pick your actions. Imagine you're playing on a sports team, like you're on the field, you're playing this other game, then you go to the sideline and the people are still on the field playing the game, and then somebody in the crowd is like, oh no, you should do this, you should do that. And then you as an athlete or as a player now start going into the crowd and arguing with that person, trying to like combat that person, like, no, I'll play, I'll dunk on you, I'll do this. That's not good use of your time. They're just a fan. They're just somebody who's just going to be yelling from the sideline. They're also not involved. Just try to find people who are at least as involved in the information in whatever field that you want to deal with, that are as involved as you are in that thing. If you want to discuss, have certain conversations about something that you think, if you think something is a 6 of importance and you've invested a 6 amount of time into it, don't debate that with people who are at a 1 on that thing. You're wasting your time. Talk to the other 6s on their side or people who are above that and see if they can inspire you to be higher. But LeBron James doesn't go around walking around and trying to pick up games with just people who are just playing random games on some courts. No, he's like, I'm going to play the all-stars. I'm going to play the top people because those are the people on his level. So that's just something I think you can think of. Yeah.
Well, I've criticized them a lot, but I'm always critical of the left-wing comedians for that, because if you think about it, I've mentioned this probably before, but the format of their show, it's editing things out of context, mocking them when the people can't defend it, and then finding clips of the least informed members of the opposing audience to laugh at. It's like, no, like, number one, I get bored talking to people that I know more or better than, and number two, it's like it's not really an accomplishment, as we're saying. It's like anyone can misrepresent someone's arguments when they're not around and then refute the misrepresentation. That's why it's called a straw man. It's easy to knock over. Anyone can find uninformed people to laugh at and feel superior to, but are you engaging people who actually know the material and can hold their own, or people who know better than you and you actually learn from? No, you just want to feel superior next to misrepresentations and uninformed people. Oh.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Next paragraph. The long-range power of the Black Rebellion is further threatened by the deep division within this class, in parentheses, the rise of a Negro bourgeoisie, and by its marginal, in terms of the capitalist system, social function. The majority of the black population does not occupy a decisive position in the process of production, and the white organization of labor have not exactly gone out of their way to change the situation. In the cynical terms of the system, a large part of this population is quote unquote expendable. That is to say, it makes no essential contribution to the productivity of the system. Consequently, the powers that may not hesitate to apply the extreme measures of suppression if the movement becomes dangerous. The fact is that at present in the United States, the black population appears as the quote unquote most natural force of rebellion. All right.
Okay. It's saying majority of the black population is involved in production, but would he argue that the majority of the white population is? Or is he just saying
that? I don't get that. Because I even think of that line from The Butler where Martin Luther King says to someone, young brother, the black domestic played an important role in our country's history. Like, are you going to say that? Yeah, I mean, because the thing is, I've talked to people who've studied African American studies, and they've made the opposite argument. Like, sharecroppers came here from the South to build parts of the city. Oh, you're going to say they're not involved in the economy? Like, I don't get how you make that argument.
Yeah. Like one thing I will be very curious is what would he think about these essential, non-essential workers? Like, now that this current pandemic happened, like that's something that is still, that's one of the major things coming out of this that will be very interesting to watch. Just the fact that we just have gone through a very interesting recalculation of which groups of people, just that term, it's a very loaded term that now said X people are essential, X people are non-essential. Now, based on what? Based on what kind of sections? Like, we're talking about the different hierarchies I mentioned before. We do understand there are hierarchies, but when people try to tie hierarchies to race or to gender, to someone's sex, to someone's biology in that kind of sense, in that collectivized sense, it's not effective. Like I just posted this recent thing, like something that's not going to happen. You're not going to have all women say for equality, we're going to pool all our funds together and have
Yeah.
all those funds redistributed to everybody in our field. Like I even said specific field. Let's just say every nurse in the United States of America, they say to show an example that males don't make, that women don't make much, we're going to say no matter where we work, whether we work in some small town in Poughkeepsie, Idaho, that is a small clinic that handles like that has 10 beds, or I'm working in New York City in the most used place that has like 100 like or 200 beds, and I'm working for like if me and the nurse in Poughkeepsie both work 40 hours a week, we're just going to pool our money together, and then all the money in the state, in the country, will be evenly and just allotted out evenly. No one would want to say that
No.
because they understand there's different hierarchies in different fields. Yet, a nurse will say, that same nurse in New York will say, oh, it's racist because there's a racial wage gap. Yet she wouldn't say that it's nursist or whatever or locationist because the nurse in Poughkeepsie doesn't get paid the same as she does, working the same hours in the same job. This is the weird thing that it's just what is going on in some of these terms, and this is the lack of people don't really understand economics. The field of economics, there's a reason the field of economics, financial economics, is very new because first of all, we haven't really lived in societies where the economic system, financial economics, was so complicated. It was normally like I know the farmer. The reason people were called bakers because you knew the person who baked the bread. You knew what they did, and chances are you knew the person who planted the grain that helped them bake the bread. You knew the mason that built the oven so you had all that knowledge. Yet now we live in this global economy, and people still think they can make certain judgments based on that, and you can't. There's just a lot going on in here it's very difficult, and I think you see that a lot with some of these people who are speaking about sociology, whenever they start talking about economics, you're like, you know nothing about that field.
No.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Well, it talks about it. It's interesting, too, how he's framing this about threatened by a deep division within this class, the rise of a Negro bourgeoisie. Well, there's a few things to say that. Is it bad that black people are making more money and becoming wealthy? Because, I mean, Marxists used to say, liquidate the bourgeoisie. Okay, does that include them, too? Or do they become part of the revolution? And then if they become part of the revolution, do you just favor them because of their race? And then, it just opens up more questions. And then, what else was I going to say? Yeah, I think that's about it. I mean, natural force of rebellion again. Yeah, it made sense then. Now, I mean, LeBron James railing about how oppressed he isn't really serious. I mean, he spoke for Hillary Clinton. I mean, that's as establishment as you get.
Yeah.
Oh, I knew you'd be excited to see her. I didn't know you'd be excited to see me too. It's like you are an establishment shill, dude. Oh man. I'll just read the next two paragraphs together because they're pretty small.
Okay.
The development of a true consciousness is still the professional function of the universities. No wonder then that the student opposition meets with the all but pathological hatred on the part of the so-called quote-unquote community, including large sections of organized labor. To the degree which the university becomes dependent on the financial and political goodwill of the community and of the government, the struggle for a free and critical education becomes a vital part in the larger struggle for change. The semi-democratic process works of necessity against radical change because it produces and sustains a popular majority whose opinion is generated by dominant interest in the status quo. As long as this condition prevails, it makes sense to say that the general will is always wrong in as much as it objectively counteracts a possible transformation of society into the more humane ways of life. To be sure, the method of persuasion is still open to the minority, but it is fatally reduced by the fact that the leftist minority does not possess the large funds required for equal access to the mass media, which speak day and night for the dominant interest. With those wholesome interludes in favor of the opposition that buttress the illusory faith in prevailing equality and fair play. And yet, without the continuous effort of persuasion of reducing one by one the hostile majority, the prospects of the opposition would still be darker than they are. All right, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, well, like you were saying that could have been the time of back then. Maybe it was different. It was more right wing that had the actual controls of some of the things, and you can still argue with some of the things. People might say politically there was a time when The people who were presenting might have been more leftist, but then the people who were running the studios and things like that might have been voting more towards the political right for several reasons until they started realizing how much you can actually have involvement, and there was a growth through the regulations and involvement where the political class got more powerful, and then it was like, oh, we're going to get these people. So they might personally vote a certain way, but they still fund the growth of the state in that kind of system. So I think that's the little chuckle that you had there. I think I agree that, and that back then that might have been the reality. I don't know, but it's definitely
Yeah,
not.
well, like, he's probably thinking of like the hippies that were at Vietnam protests and things like that. Yeah, those people didn't have a lot of power. Sure, they're just protesters, but today you have to be insane to think that.
Yeah. Okay, and something here you said what was it the thing? Okay, the pathological hatred said no wonder the student opposition meets with sorry, no wonder then that the student opposition meets with the all but pathological hatred on a part of the so-called community, including large sections of organized labor. So here he was saying that the development of true consciousness is still the professional function of universities. Now, this is something that they still think, that people come out to the most educated and they feel that they're on that situation. It says, no wonder the student opposition meets with the all but pathological hatred of the so-called community. Now, I don't know about this. There is something where, depending on who you call in the community, it's in quotations, but large sections of organized labor, the most educated people coming out of universities seem to vote for the same kind of parties that most of the unionized people in the United States of America do. And now that's, again, because now these things, like if the unions, there's, first of all, there's a lot of public sector unions, which are, of course, going to vote for, which in general vote for the growth of the state, maintenance of the state, more redistribution of taxes, because they end up getting those things, more security in their jobs, more pension plans and things like that. And then a lot of the students now from university seem to go into these public sector unionized jobs and private sector unionized jobs that are with a union. Now those unions have a very strong partnership with, they have their own lobbyist groups, they have their own organization of things like that. So now they have influences and they have a lot of interest in the government. So you have a lot of people graduating who go to direct government jobs that are not necessarily unionized, then public sector unions, private sector unions. So I don't think that dynamic is still something that is quite accurate to today. I think you look at majority of the, there could be a difference with the actual union members versus the union brass, but I think in general you'll see they're on similar footing, people with degrees coming out of colleges and people in unionized sectors.
Yeah, I think when he says true consciousness, he means critical consciousness, basically, what we've been talking about. Let's see here. Free and critical education. Well, critical free, he means like liberated, but of course he means Marxist. I wouldn't say education today, I would not say is well-rounded at all. I mean, there are people who've been in universities for years who have no idea about any of the people we like. That's frequently pointed out how a lot of libertarian types have read Marx, these people, all this, but like there are a lot of people on the left that have never touched or even heard of some of the people we like. Like there are people who think libertarians read Ayn Rand exclusively. You would know that you would know that objectivism and libertarianism are different philosophies, that she was critical of libertarianism. Plus we have a whole other slew of thinkers, but they don't even get mentioned. Like people don't even know who they are. So that shows the bias of universities where, again, I know libertarians who have read Marx, posted stuff and quoted it directly. So they've engaged the material they disagree with. What else? Radical change, popular, dominant interest in the status quo. It's funny because it's another one of those things. Like I feel like I agree with those statements, but not in the way he means. Like if you watch the lefty comedians today, it's like they're pretty much all establishment. Like they'll say things like, oh, healthcare is expensive, there's gun violence, all this, but they don't get deep into the issues of, okay, the American Medical Association restricts the number of doctors, so prices go up. They restrict the number of medical schools and hospitals, prices go up. These lobbyists own these politicians. The Federal Reserve does, like, they don't delve deep into this issue. I don't consider them rebels. I think these comedians are in the process. What they do is they present themselves as like rebellious and edgy, but in reality, they're just establishment mouthpieces. Because like I know with some of like the NSA and the spying and stuff, like I remember, I guess Snowden got interviewed by John Oliver, and Oliver was pretty rude to him. But again, it's like, because a true rebel outside of this system would want to talk to these people. If you're just going to suck up to Hillary and whoever, I mean, again, you're just your establishment. You're defending the status quo. Oh.
Yeah. Let's see if there's anything here in the second paragraph. To reduce the fact the left is minority. Yeah, as I said, that does change if we have access. They have achieved that access. So at least, I guess maybe if Marcuse was thinking there was an issue, and that's something that people like Angela Davis saw as an issue, and it's something they have addressed in an excellent way. And in part because like a lot of people come through universities and they understand there's some control in there. A lot of these people come through I think you look at the number of human resource graduates at the time of Marcuse versus the human resources graduates today, and I think there'll be a massive increase in the actual of that, and then you see the effect of these people coming out college educated and entering the human resources, and now these human resources development people also are involved in like the unions, and they part of deciding who is in union membership, what they're going to be doing in that. So there is something in there, and this is something pernicious about that actual field in general.
Yeah.
Especially when you see how many leftists are towards, how many people in human resources vote for political left ideals and so-called progressive type of things. And at the same point, they will start talking about how human beings are individuals and they're not just machines. Yet they're the ones who actually just, in reality, they kind of commodify people and say, you will move you as a widget here. And in a sense, I think once you have that human labor, you actually are that kind of way. And that's the thing, like, instead of their actions, if they really didn't think human beings were supposed to be judged on their actions and their results and their abilities to do things, why would they be so interested in entering human resources if they didn't look at humans and their actions as a resource? So they're like, oh, we're all the same. If we're all the same, why do we need human resources if we can just put people in there? It's like you say one thing, but you do the other. So where are you after that?
Yeah. Well, like your example about redistributing money, it's like you're all about equality, but then when it's like, oh, we're going to take some from you and give it to someone else. No, we can't have that. It's like, well, I thought you wanted equality. Do you actually believe in this thing, or is it just rhetoric? Yeah. All right. The alternative is not democratic evolution versus radical action, but rationalization of the status quo versus change. As long as the social system reproduces by indoctrination and integration, a self-perpetuating conservative majority, the majority reproduces the system itself, open to changes within, but not beyond its institutional framework. Consequently, the struggle for change beyond the system becomes, by virtue of its own dynamic, undemocratic in the terms of the system, and counter-violence is from the beginning inherent in this dynamic. Thus, the radical is guilty either of surrendering to the power of the status quo or of violating the law and order of the status quo.
Again, here, this is part of why the people on this political side have to maintain that they're not part of the status quo. Because in a lot of the writing, in the people who have inspired a lot of these movements, it's based on the aspect that they are the oppressed, that the other classes are oppressed. So you have to maintain that dynamic in order for everything else to actually occur. Like, the devil must be the devil. You cannot be on the devil's side. Everything for what you're doing to be just, you have to have the other side be the devil. Otherwise, your premises and your behavior all of a sudden changes into a thing. You don't have the actual justification for your behavior. And then what else was here? So again, and he mentions here the self-perpetuating conservative majority. The majority reproduces the system itself. And here again, it's not necessarily that. Now, this is something, could it be who is conservative? Because you look at some of the things and they're actually trying to conserve the way the world was in the 70s and 60s in order to maintain the dynamic. So in a sense, they're trying to conserve the racial tensions that existed in the 60s and 70s in pre-civil rights America. They're trying to conserve that the white people are the oppressor class that have kept other people oppressed, like the black people are entirely enslaved. Maybe in a way they're trying to conserve that mindset, and in a way, whatever is in control of the system will inherently try to conserve itself. So now, back then, people on the political right were in control of the system, so the people on the political right were trying to conserve their ideologies, their virtues, and the things they consider positive. And now that people on the political left are in control of the systems, all those things, they're also trying to conserve what they're doing. Like, conservative itself isn't in the idea of conservative, the actions of being a conservative, as in I want to conserve this, doesn't mean the thing you're conserving is inherently right wing, is inherently to the right politically. You don't have to. Some people are trying to conserve dictatorship. Some people are trying to conserve Satanism. Some people are trying to conserve Christianity. Some people are trying to conserve the structures of freedom. You can conserve anything. You can conserve water. You can conserve the woods. You can say, I'm trying to conserve this place as a desert. I'm trying to conserve this place as wetlands. There's different things you can be conserving. So maybe in that kind of sense, it still is the system. It's still accurate that the system is trying to conserve itself and reproduce itself. But it's just now there's somebody else in control of that machine and in control of that industry that's perpetuating itself.
Yeah, I was pretty much going to say the same thing.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. All right. So I think there's two paragraphs here, pretty big, but that'll be it. But who has the right to set himself up as judge of an established society? Who other than the legally constituted agencies or agents and the majority of the people? Other than these, it could only be a self-appointed elite or leaders who would arrogate themselves such judgment. Indeed, if the alternative were between democracy and dictatorship, no matter how quote-unquote benevolent, the answer would be non-controversial. Democracy is preferable. However, this democracy does not exist, and the government is factually exercised by a network of pressure groups and quote-unquote machines, vested interest represented by and working on and through the democratic institutions. These are not derived from a sovereign people. The representation is representative of the will shaped by the ruling minorities. Consequently, if the alternative is ruled by an elite, it would only mean replacement of the present ruling elite by another, and if this other should be the dreaded intellectual elite, it may not be less qualified and less threatening than the prevailing one. True, such government initially would not have the endorsement of the majority, quote unquote, inherited from the previous government. But once the chain of the past governments is broken, the majority would be in a state of flux and released from the past management, free to judge the new government in terms of the common interest. To be sure, this has never occurred. This has never been in the course of revolution, but it is equally true that never before has a revolution occurred which had at its disposal the present achievements of productivity and technical progress. Of course, they could be effectively used for imposing another set of repressive controls, but our entire discussion was based on the proposition that the revolution would be liberating only if it were carried by the non-repressive forces stirring in the existing society. The proposition is no more and no less than a hope. Prior to its realization, it is indeed only the individuals who can judge with no other legitimation than their consciousness and conscience. But these individuals are more and other than private persons with their particular contingent preferences and interests. Their judgment transcends their subjectivity to the degree which it is based on independent thought and information, on a rational analysis and evaluation of their society. The existence of a majority of individuals capable of such rationality has been assumed, on which the democratic theory has been based. If the established majority is not composed of such individuals, it does not think, will, and act as sovereign people. All right.
Okay. Something at the start here, it says, indeed, if the alternative were between democracy and dictatorship, no matter how benevolent, the answer would be non-controversial. Democracy is preferable. And I agree with that. And I agreed with much of what Marcuse said. And when I wrote that thing of, isn't democratic socialism just populist fascism, somebody asked, how come there are no good fascists? And I was talking about how that's a tough term. And there might be no way to actually be a good fascist, because there's some things that there's some things that it can't be good. Like you can't, in a good way, violate the non-aggression principle or the zero aggression principle. Like if you accept that as a principle, and I find that to be a rather, I haven't found an argument against that actual thing, like in a good way. Like you can do certain things that you can say it's, like for example, you can't say I'm committing good assault or good abuse. I'm committing good abuse against this person. There is no term like that. I can do there can be something where it's like, okay, you can say you would prefer me to, it would be preferable to have somebody break your finger if you lie versus break your arm if you lie. Now, none of those are good abuse, but one that is preferable abuse. But the abuse by definition of itself is not a positive thing. Like just like a dictatorship is somebody using their ability to, by force, control what you do. So there's nothing good about that action. You can't do that in a good way. You can't force people to do things in a good way. You can't dictate in a good way. you can dictate in worse ways, in more brutal ways, in more harmful ways than just the basic dictation, but inherently that dictatorship is that. And there are aspects of that in democracy, depending on different systems. And that's why the United States of America is one of the most preferable democracies to live in due to the republic and this system of laws, the electoral college and things like that that I've talked about in separate locations, where it's not just 50 plus one, where it's not just a situation where like in a mob, in a lynch mob, in a situation you only have entire agreement besides the one person that's being lynched. If you look back in the past and you say, when a black man had been accused of something and the lynch mob comes in and they say, oh, we're going to lynch this person, all the white people in place were agreement besides the one black person. But is that positive? Because, oh, we've taken a vote? When you have, it was like Chelsea Handler. If Chelsea Handler is like an individual, this supposed comedian, Chelsea Handler is somebody that's on your team, that's a team I don't want to be a part of. Right now, the Derek Chauvin trial is going on, and she posts something and she says, oh, like, look, this person's having a trial. Like in America, why do we have to have a trial to prove this man did this when there's a video of him murdering George Floyd? And even if she was just joking, she didn't really put it in context. It's a tweet. I understand that thing. But people who like a comment like that, just think about the precedent. How many, like we're trying to be, the same people who are trying to tell us about how evil white people have been and how oppressed they have are liking a white woman saying something, saying we don't need court case to prove that X did this because of this thing that we've seen. Now, you can say it's different because it's a video. You can ignore the actual evidence and the actual medical examiner things and the questions that came up in the opening statements, which I suggest, again, with something like this, if somebody wants to talk about this, ask them, did they listen to the opening statements? And if you haven't taken the time to take the 45 minutes or so to listen to the opening statements of the prosecution and the defense, that's in general somebody that's not worth discussing these topics with. But anyway, they make that statement. We've seen how that's gone, specifically white women making accusations about what actions men did and how much other men lynched that person to do it. So I think it's a benefit to have that process. Yes, it might be costly. Yes, it might be questions, but these questions are better to have a system where the stuff is kind of answered. So right now, the system in the United States of America is preferable to the things that I've seen in many places in the world. Is it the best system? Is it something that can't be improved? No, I disagree. Now, that's something where I think I also disagree with a lot of people on the political right and the conservative type of thing, self-identified conservatives who say we just need the United States of America as it was in the past. I'm like, I didn't really like it so much in the past. I think it's kind of better now, despite these things you might say about it. And I don't think going back to the past, you can convince me that there's ways to go back to that past state and not just return to something similar to this just 50 or 100 years in the future. So that's the kind of situation I'm in with some of these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all I really had to say was some of the criticisms he's making are legitimate, like talking about, pressure groups and machines. Like I just mentioned, the American Medical Association, they're not derived from a sovereign people. He's right. But like, I feel like it just keeps coming back to the usual, like, oh, in my ideal society, this wouldn't happen. It's like, well, then everything's either going to be government run and that gets into issues with socialism, or it's going to just become corrupted by their private interests. Like, I don't think the criticism starts out valid and then it's just like, but it just seems to be more of the same.
Yeah, like he says here, the representation is representative of the will shaped by the ruling minorities. And that's what you see with these. And not even just the identity politics type of situation where now supposedly you have a coalition of majority of the different minority voting groups to create this situation where they have control of the power. But those things, some of the things advocated by these groups are really not even held in general by most of the people. Like you look at some of the things that are advocated by the top people on social issues, and you look at, as I mentioned, the most down the line voting bloc for the Democrats is black women, and they're rather socially conservative. A lot of Christians. That's the thing. I think this is something that I think we need to debate. What is conservative? Because some of the behaviors that they have, they have most children married out of wedlock. I think it's the highest percentage within black women.
Yeah.
Now, this could be a different inverse thing. They could be a small amount. It could be 25% of black women are also accounting for 50% of the births or 65% of the births, whereas you have in white women, you have 20% of the white women only account for maybe 30% of the births. So since you have a situation where those 20% of unmarried black women are having way more kids than the 20% of unmarried white women, then it might seem like more black kids are born out of wedlock, but when it comes down to if you look at the percent of black women that have kids out of wedlock, it might be a lot closer to the percent of Asian women that have kids out of wedlock. But it's just that those black women are having way more kids, whereas in the Asians, the percent of women that have of Asian births, it would be the situation where the married women have way more kids than the unmarried Asians. So that could be something that's messing those those figures up. But in general, what I'm saying, when it comes to the actual trans rights and like what percent of the Democrats' voting bloc is really like, yay, the military, now you can have trans people in there. Like, what percentage of the United States of America is actually boosted that now they can join the military and get a and get surgery or get the procedure to transition? Like, it seems like that's got to be a million people tops who really care about that. Yet that's something that's being announced and publicized from the major news channels and being published and trending on Twitter and things. I'm like, why is that trending? Who really cares about that? And that's what I say. The representation is a representative of the will shaped by the ruling minorities. That's just what it is.
Well, that's like what I said about that makeup thing. It's like they show like a trans guy with like facial hair, and I'm like, are there really all these women who are going to see that and going to come out and be like, yes, I'll buy that now because they've gone woke? It's like, it's like, yeah, some trans people may, but it's again, then how many of them wear makeup, and then how many of them buy that brand? And it's like, you narrow it down. It's like, how many people is this really benefiting?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What else was in here? Privatization is the individuals are more than the private judge. The judgment transcends the subjectivity of the degrees. I think there might have been something else in here, but it's skipping my mind. You got anything else?
No, I was just going to read the last paragraph.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead.
Political linguistics armor of the establishment. If the radical opposition develops its own language, it protests spontaneously, subconsciously against one of the most effective, quote-unquote, secret weapons of domination and defamation. The language of the prevailing law and order, validated by the courts and by the police. It is not only the voice, but also the deed of suppression. This language not only defines and condemns the enemy, it also creates him. And this creation is not the enemy as he really is, but rather as he must be in order to perform his function for the establishment. The end now does just justify the means. Actions cease to be crimes if they serve to protect, to preserve, and extend the quote-unquote free world. Conversely, what the enemy does is evil. What he says, propaganda. This a priori linguistic defamation hit first the enemy abroad. The defense of his own land, his own hut, his own naked life is a crime. The supreme crime which deserves the supreme punishment. Long before the special, not so special forces are physically trained to kill, burn, and interrogate, their minds and bodies are already desensitized to see and hear and smell in the other, not a human being, but a beast. A beast, however, which is subject to all-out punishment. The linguistic pattern constantly repeats itself. In Vietnam, a quote-unquote typical criminal communist violence is perpetrated against Americans, quote-unquote strategic operations. The Reds have the impertinence to launch a sneak attack. Presumably, they are supposed to announce it beforehand and deploy in the open. They are, quote-unquote, evading a death trap. Presumably, they should have stayed in. The Viet Cong attack American barracks in the quote-unquote dead of night, and they kill American boys. Presumably, only American boys in broad daylight. Don't disturb the sleep of the enemy and don't kill the Vietnamese boys. The massacre of hundreds of thousands of communists in Indonesia is called impressive. A comparable quote-unquote killing rate suffered by the other side would hardly have been honored with such an adjective. To the Chinese, the presence of American troops in East Asia is a threat to their quote-unquote ideology, while presumably the presence of Chinese troops in Central or South America would be a real and not only an ideological threat to the United States.
Interesting. Oh, there was one thing from before, just I think it is something I took on notes, was talking about the revolutions, and it was talking about the situation with there was something in the paragraph before talking about revolutions, and I was just thinking about with the ideas of the proposition of the revolution would only be liberating if it was carried by non-repressive forces stirring in the existing society. That part right there, I was just kind of thinking like almost no revolution really, the people who are involved in the revolution never really are thinking we're going to oppress these people more after.
No.
But I don't think majority of revolutions have led to objectively more freedom once the once the people who were involved in the revolution had now usurped and removed the structures and were in the positions of power that the people that they said were removing were in, I think if you look in history, majority of those revolutions, at least at the beginning, resulted in more oppression of the people, and most of them actually needed to run their course before there was actually, and most of those revolutions didn't actually get overthrown by another revolution. They just actually were so oppressive that they actually ended those societies, or they just crumbled to a point where the society broke apart and had to rebuild itself from a situation that was objectively less structuralized, less secure, less protected, less civilized than the initial status compared to the other places, if that makes any sense. Like revolutions.
Well, I thought about this with Dr. Zhivago, because there's the whole thing about, oh, the czar has been arrested, and they're like, oh, is Lenin the czar now? And they're like, oh, there's no czar, it's going to be workers, place, freedom, all this. And then one of these guys, he gets his house seized, quote unquote, in the name of the people, and he's like, wait, let me go in here, this is my house. They're like, no, you can't do that. He's like, but I'm one of the people. They're like, no, if you do this, the party says that it's counter-revolutionary and you're a criminal. So it's like, they come into power promising all this stuff, but once in power, it's probably it was worse than the czar, I would say. Oh.
Yeah. So there's just something that to think of when people think about revolutions, and the people who are involved in the revolution don't think they're going to be about oppression, but it often ends up being kind of worse for the general public after the revolution takes place. So that could be something that we're seeing right now. And I do think there is a bit of a cultural war in the United States of America and some kind of revolutionary ideas coming around, but it's not as destructive as some revolutions have been historically, thankfully, at least not yet. Now, with this last paragraph that you mentioned, I just kept thinking about how much this sounds like these theological languages here. The way, like, if I do this, it's in a certain way. If somebody does this, it's in a different way. And it's not necessarily this political idea is becoming religious. It's more that these are political ideas coming from religion, and religion itself came from creating structures and ideas around observations that the human animal had about society, about societal structures and things like that. It's not like these ideas were invented by religion, specifically not invented by theologies. This whole idea of good and evil, I think those things pre-existed, the concepts of good and evil pre-existed religions. Then we started attributing them to this supernatural, this external place. And then once you had that point, there was theological structures that kind of codified and made more sense, that were easier to pass on those general observations that people made about the realities and sites they were living in. And now we live in a place where there's more complicated, sometimes convoluted structures, where religion itself is rather nebulous. Now you need political systems that came from that were more apt to kind of pass on and have people make sense and feel like they're a part of these structures. Because why do Americans need to go kill Viet Cong? Because they somehow are a threat to the American way of living. Like you have to put those things together, because it wasn't just a general thing where it's like, that person has killed your father, so you need to kill them. So there had to be some added thing for you to kind of add that aspect to it. Now you go past the basic religion, this person believes what you believe, because that person there might believe in the same God that you believe in. So you have to now have this other thing that's different, that separates you from that person, for it to be okay for you to kill that person. Because technically, if you just were going off of the theology, if a Viet Cong was praying and then you have a Muslim next to you, or like a black person who's an atheist, technically should you shoot the atheist because this is your fellow like Christian? So these are the kind of structures where it's just, these are the structures that the human ape needs to construct in order to have different civilizations and social constructs out there. So I think that's interesting to see how he's working through some of these things. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too. You mentioned that about evil, because Edward was telling me recently. I hadn't thought about this, but I talked about Nietzsche and the whole master and slave morality in Greece and Rome, thinking in terms of good and bad, like being good and then failing at being that, and then the Jews and the Christians thought in terms of good or evil. No, there are specific things that are evil. And the reason Nietzsche named his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra is that's after Zoroaster, and I didn't realize this, but I guess Zoroaster, as far as we know, is the first of one of the major religions that's still around that actually had the concept of evil. Because again, before it was just, I think of Voldemort from Harry Potter, what he says about there's no good or evil, there's just power, and those strong enough to take it and those weak not to. That's basically how they viewed the world. Whereas Zoroaster, as far as we know, was one of the first codified religions to say, no, this is evil. This isn't just being weak or whatever.
Like you're saying, some actions are objectively evil,
Yeah.
no matter who does it. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's interesting because that's definitely not something that's in the Christian Bible. As much as the Abrahamic religions, from my knowledge, don't have those things where it's like, okay, across the board. It still involves who does it. There's still a subjective aspect to it, and I'm still not quite sure. I fluctuate with something like I mentioned. Some of the things I think just by definition, something like aggression is negative. When you do that kind of thing, you're kind of violating something that I consider a virtue. So now, is that subjective to me? Do I think there's certain things that are objective morality? Does that exist? I think there are some things that probably would. I would say yes, there's a way to do that. But in general, most of the things are subjective, where it depends on who it is. Like compared to today, like I said, the average person today is more moral in general than the most moral people 100 years ago, just from the basic things that they do in their life. And 100 years ago, 100 years ago, 100, I think even 100, something like that. So that kind of aspect changes. Like I don't look back and say like, okay, everybody in the Bible is in general just kind of a horrific person, just from the basic things. Like people just accepted slavery as an aspect of, those good people who kept slaves. At that time, they're good. But am I supposed to say now I'm going to damn the entire human history because people were okay with slaves in the past? I don't know. That's something that comes up to people's questioning.
That's all I have. This was a pretty long section. Like I say, the next one I only have a few paragraphs because a lot of it's like kind of stuff he said that we've talked about. So it's going to be shorter. We'll just do that in the conclusion next time.
Okay.
Yep.
So that's it for me too. I think I've finally gotten the first part of this published. So after I'm done recording this, I shall upload that part. So we are recording this on Thursday. So on Friday, April 2nd, the first part will be out, and I don't know when this part will be out compared to that time. But we've already mentioned we shall have the Why We Believe in God series. That sounds like a good one to go over. And then, of course, Human Action is still pending, is still coming in. I think I'll talk to you, Stephen. I think it might be interesting to do like a locals type of thing where we can get people who are interested enough in this to, or we'll just need to figure out a way, I think,
we'll figure it out,
engage people in a more direct way and get more involved in this. I'm enjoying doing this. Stephen is back in New York, as you've seen. The background has changed there. He mentioned some things.
Hopefully my chair will be here soon, so I'm not awkwardly sitting on the suitcase. It's kind of uncomfortable. It should be here. I think they said by next Monday, so we'll see. Because alternatively, I could sit on my bed, but that's kind of annoying too. So,
all right.
But
so that's it for me. Links will be below to the other parts and this document itself. Let us know what you think about this. If we've gotten some things wrong, if we missed some things over, some points that you think were worthwhile or worth going over that you think you can help us with or counter what we said, would be much appreciated. Anything else, Stephen?
That's all I have.
Okay, me too. Goodbye.
Goodbye-bye.